Good morning, friends. WordofGord OBE Journal 2017. Continuing on. I've got a hunch that we're number 18 or number 19. I'm just not quite sure. Forgive me, it's a little early in the morning. I think it was the news yesterday that the Spanish government has given its permission for the body of Salvador Dali to be disinterred so that some paternity suit can be settled from whatever available DNA there is. That got me thinking about Salvador and artists in the afterlife generally. I seem to have visited last night, just a few hours, well, last night, it's still night now, a few hours ago. And as I focus on that segment of exploration, what I see now is a sort of a golden haze and a dull yellow haze, not bright, shiny, that I'm looking at. And out of it, slowly and sort of gracefully, comes a hand with a paintbrush. And that paintbrush starts to, do strokes. And I'm watching it, amused, curious, thinking, there's a little tricky little experiment going on here. No verbal communication, no telepathy that I can track. And the painting goes on. The hand sort of disappears, back into the golden haze, as if, and I'm thinking, okay, it's going back to the palette or something, and comes back out, and slowly, I can't tell what it is, small landscape, a series of, textures and slight color variations, and so in the tradition of time-lapse photography, I begin to see a face appear, and it is, of course, the recognizable image of Salvador Dali. And care is taken to reproduce a familiar image. And again, sort of is in this retro view, looking back at what happened a few hours ago. I'm seeing it slowly come to life, if you like. And I'm quite charmed by the whole process. And I just stand and watch. And after a time, the face does come clearly into view, very precise, and as his portraits often were, of himself or others. Not really any hint of surrealism, so far anyway. And there's not really much of a background to frame him. He's just, where he's onto the neck and the shoulders now. And as I say, the hand is the one hand is doing everything. Lovely. And again, I'm not getting any telepathic communication. He's letting the image in the process speak for itself. So he's painting himself into existence. He's recreating himself. And a lovely comment, don't you think? So yeah, I'm asking you to see a fairly recognizable, at least from the the artwork and the photography too, of Salvador Dali in about middle age, that many of you will have seen. And if you haven't seen it, you can certainly check it. I'm sure there's images on the internet all over the place. But a charmingly original way to recreate it. And I'm not getting any, as I say, telepathic information about his activities, his life over there, what he's interested in now. Is it still art? Is it other things? Does he give master classes? I'm willing to bet he does. But I'm not getting any info on that. He's limiting himself to this image. A waistcoat with buttons over a shirt is appearing. So it's kind of a torso, chest, neck, head shot, shoulders, and the arms. And so yeah, I'm getting him an image here of him painting. Well, is it the right arm? It seems to be, and painting the left hand and arm. Oh, and the left hand and arm is holding up, and sort of like so, and then he paints a small, as though it's holding a small picture frame, rectangular picture frame. And he's starting to move fairly quickly now. The color is coming from the paintbrush quite quickly. It's sort of almost like it's squirting. I mean, he's stroking, but it's coming on quite fast. And it disappears when it comes back at it. And what's in that little frame? Something's emerging, and I'm trying to see what it is. It's quite small. Oh no, really? It's a tiny image of a hovering. Looks to me like a hummingbird, but I'm not that great on birds. But it's got that image of the hummingbird with the very fast fluttering wings in a blur, and it's just hovering there, and there's a sort of a wire coming down from its beak, and coming down from its beak at the end of the wire. And what's coming in at the end of the wire? Hovering, bird hovering down, and a very small image. And of course, on the astral plane, you can sort of magnify things, and whether they're at distance or close. And if this was on the physical plane, I'd barely be able to see it at all. My eyes aren't that great anymore. And okay, he's painting in what looks to me like a tiny little helicopter. Yeah. The hummingbird is holding a helicopter on a wire from its beak. I wouldn't say the helicopter's that detailed, but it's very definitely a helicopter. So there he is, standing there, looking directly at me, as some portraitures emphasize, rather than a look or a smile or a hint. It's just looking directly. And with that great sense of sort of elegance and style that he always had. So as he's reaffirming a certain, the image of his physical plane life, last incarnation, rather than hinting at other forms that he may have moved on to, other looks. He may have done that, but what we're getting is a reassertion, a reaffirmation of the way he used to be, which is maybe what he thinks people want to see. And then the added surrealism of the little rectangle frame in the hand, which is have the image that I described. And I get the feeling that he's just going to hold that and not do any more. So I'll leave you with that image. I thought he might have be irritated or annoyed at being, being dug up for DNA and paternity suits, but he doesn't seem to be that affected, at least not in this encounter. Maybe he's saving that for later. But thank you, Salvador. Wonderful. A number of, and here's, it's sort of like the next thought. I'm still there looking at the Dolly thing, but I'm thinking of William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet, occultist, and mystic, who's passed, 1939, I believe. So that's a good 80 years. But he's been written about by a number of lucid dreamers like Robert Moss, and channelers and explorers like Frank DeMarco and others. And I think he likes to be active, to be involved with people that are doing mystical explorations, because he was. He was, part of the Order of the Golden Dawn, a theosophist. He attended seances, did magical workings. You can read some of this in his autobiographies and memoirs. So maybe it's just a natural that people would want to contact him, and he'd want to be a facilitator from the astral plane. And I'd encountered him in other people's writings many times, and wondered about, I haven't sort of, up until this very minute, hadn't had any feeling that I'd contacted him myself. But in front of the Dali image, I do begin to, meditate on him and get focused. And go to where he is, or where he appears to be. Apparently he has more than one astral plane dwelling. He maintains a small cottage for those who wish to visit him in the mode of the I will arise and go now, the Innisfree image. And there's also a smart, fashionable townhome in in the, what would appear to be the astral version of Dublin, and where he leads, you know, an astral plane urban life, cultured, scholarly, you know, that sort of a thing. And he is still, I'm getting this sort of telepathically, I haven't actually sat down with him yet, actively involved in the issues of Irish culture, Irish nationalist culture, and the reaffirmation of its soul spiritual identity, aside from getting swallowed up by the British Empire, which of course was a reality for him in his past incarnation, and something he was very focused on, he and some others. And he still feels that's important and it should go on the astral plane as well as, you know, here on Earth. And the you know, okay, now I seem to be sitting with him in his home, in the Dublin home, or the astral plane Dublin, and it wasn't that hard to get to see. I mean, you can suddenly sort of zero in on people, and they might be busy doing things, but for somehow or other he wasn't, and I'm sure he is active, but he made time for me, which was very nice. And he's saying, "Oh, wait a minute, this is one of myself that's making time for you, Gordon." I'm getting as we sit down. He has another Yeats that's out doing stuff. He said that Yeats is busy, but this one isn't, and I keep this one for interviews. He said a lot of people want to see me these days, and I have no objection. I put myself at their service, and I understand that they are active spiritual seekers in the way that I was, and I'm passing along the kindnesses that were shown to me. He's telling me that the life that he lives now, or the lives, is the fruit of his earthly life, and he's, you know, pleased to feel that is so. It feels like a very natural progression to him, and uh, it fits well, he says, and he has only a few urges to quit that particular scenario, that particular incarnational journey, which is continuing on now, um, and, you know, be another person another time. He's getting notions that he could and should do that, but they're not pressing notions, not as yet. And then he says, even if I do reincarnate, um, there will still be the essence of William Butler Yeats to be communicated with here. That will be made available, and by my own efforts, he says. And he says this is more common than you would think. Historical personalities do feel a commitment to being around, being there for those who wish to contact them in a sort of serious, focused manner. He says it's part of our karma to be there for people because we created a scenario, an image, uh, a body of work, which will arouse, you know, not merely the fulfillment of our ambitions, but the fulfillment, the potential fulfillment of our followers and our fans. And it is only right that we be there for them. He's involved in all the cultural activities that he was here on Earth, and theater, multimedia projects, films that accurately recreate the Irish myths, ancient Irish myths of, he says, our glory days are long past, but there's no reason for them not to be enshrined in art. And they were, I was involved in that before, and I continue to be involved, and it's a fascinating activity. Not merely recreating the myths in an accurate way, because I can time travel now. It's easy enough to visit and see the various versions of what went on, because each telling of a myth is a version created by the teller. And we can, with the magical technologies available to us here, we can create a series of moving images, a film that shows various attitudes and aspects of the same story, in fact, simultaneously. He says, you've seen split screens down there? Well, we use those here too. And he's sensing that I'm going to ask a question about James Joyce. And I guess he's thinking, oh well, he's come to see me. He'll be interested in all my contemporaries. And I hadn't actually thought of that, but he seems to be anticipating it. And I said, well, perhaps I'll get to that later, but it's very gracious of you to spend some time with me and communicate in this open and friendly manner. And I said, you are aware that people, channelers and explorers, have written about you in books, your post-mortem self. And he goes, oh yes, I fully encourage that. It is important that people see the continuity of personality and expression on this plane. I think as a practicing spiritualist and theosophist in my past, I understood that myself and tried to communicate it to the majority of the greater majority of those who did not follow these matters and needed to be enlightened, although a lot of them refused to look. And but I felt it was important, and I still do. Mm. The room we're in has a sort of late Victorian aspect to it, which he seems to be quite comfortable in. I'm sure the rural Innisfree version of Yeats is much more countrified and bare bones, and living close to nature and its spirits. And he picks up my thought and says, "Oh yes, it is." And this is where I interact creatively and extensively with human culture, and the cottage is where I interact with nature and her many nature spirits that are always around. And one day I hope to bring both of those expressions together in a greater whole. But right now, because of people's interests and divided interests, it's better to have both. And he anticipating another question, he says, yes, all the people that you would be historical personalities you would be familiar with from my writings, Lady Gregory, Montgaunt, um, you know, the many others, Georgie, they're all here now, he said. And why would they not be? Um, there's always this, people wonder, could the dead be anywhere else but here? And of course, here is a very big place, and we are scattered, but we are connected, and we all have our own interests. Some of the people that I knew, some of the souls. We continue our soul connection here, whether our interests are parallel or not. And this interview continues for a little longer, a little more interaction, and then I stand up and thank him, and he's very gracious and hopes that my journey continues in this manner, and that people continue to be informed and inspired by what I discover and communicate. And then I take my leave. There's a certain formality as I walk out the front door and uh, onto Astral Dublin Street, which looks remarkably like a polished up Dublin wood, not that different. At least this version of Dublin, as I've hinted before, there are often in cities, astral plane cities, several versions of the same thing, depending on which level you're on. Um, and this has been pointed out in some OBE books. Not that many, but it has been pointed out. And obviously, souls here are interested in the sort of classical, traditional Dublin, raised to a level of great beauty, museum-like beauty. And in this, we see a great deal of pride, a great deal of self-assertion, and no hints of the bombed out post office in 1916, I can tell you that. Um, and when a nation is conquered and loses pride in itself, it takes some time to bring it back to full blossoming. And I sense as I look around that this is what has been attempted and achieved here. And more power to them. All nations should have that level of pride and accomplishment. Because as we rise and fall as cultures, it's easy to get attached to one phase of the rising and falling. And it's as spirits, it's better to pull back and see the whole process from remote tribal beginnings, primitive, to the fulfillment of all potentials, all cultural potentials. It's a good thing. We understand the creative nature of what we're building, outside of the petty concerns of individual lives, the troubles, the illnesses, and the struggles of the tribe and nation too, as they try to assert, defend, conquer, and get caught up in all that struggle. Each nation, each tribe blossoms into fulfillment, and that fulfillment is temporary as they move on to other challenges. The challenges of internationalism and one world concept, brotherhood of man, which we're working on right now here on Earth, and will be for quite some time. But that's again, it's just another illusion. Time's just an illusion. When we come back for our next lives, those of you who are watching this now, for me, I'll be around 2135, 2150. I've been seeing that quite clearly for a number of years. This life will look like a little chunk of interesting history. Circumstances will have changed, progressed, but much will be the same. There will still be those who resist internationalism and the one world concept and experience, and wish to fight over their petty differences in outlook and in philosophy and establishment of cultural norms. The same thing that's going on now, but it will continue in certain areas of the world because souls will return still caught up in those issues, just as they do now. And many of us will not be concerned with that. Will be much happier with our more spiritual lives, less struggle, technology that is available to everyone, and I sense a fairly close to moneyless society by then. The implications of the technologies that are being suppressed right now, as people like Stephen Greer and other researchers discuss, the alien-derived technologies, the zero-point energy equipment, the anti-gravity drives. When you have a little air conditioner-sized box in your house that warms it sufficiently in the winter and cools it sufficiently in the summer, and doesn't plug into anything, and doesn't cost you. Maybe there'll be an initial purchase price, but it won't be that much. I mean, much is dissipated at that point, much of the struggle. And robotics and various other aspects of production will render many jobs obsolete, unnecessary, and governments will have to adapt to this, and won't be much work to do. There will be some, of course, but and there will be work for the sake of work rather than work to pay the mortgage and the rent. But there'll be that sort of basic minimum income thing that we're experimenting with now. We've started a little bit of experiment here in the province I live in Ontario, in Canada, and one can see this is going to happen. um, because there will be too much turbulence in society without it, too much poverty and drug addiction and violence without it, because people need meaning in their lives, and to have meaning, they need to have sufficient income to make their lives bearable. Anyway, that will all be done by the next century, no question, in most societies, and there's no way around it. It's going to happen. We can see it, and uh, will make life a lot more pleasant for many. Although there will be different challenges, of course, and I don't mean post-apocalyptic, world collapsing around our ears type challenges. I mean challenges, just regular challenges. What to do with ourselves when we have to work 8 hours a day. That's going to be interesting for a lot of people. Um, and some people will revert to simple rural lifestyles where they make things for themselves because they enjoy the challenge. Uh, um, and more power to them if that's what they want to do. But it'll be a free choice. It won't be this sort of rejection of modern society that I saw in the hippie days of the 60s and 70s, where there was a definite rejection, and one did not wish these people did not wish the sort of corrupt ways of capitalism, and wanted to get back to self-reliance and honesty and sincerity in one's daily life, rather than what they saw as the sort of terminally corrupt and slavery-inducing capitalism that the first world was using to dominate the third world and give itself a great lifestyle. Anyway, that's a bit of political philosophy there, but I did visit others. I briefly visited James and Nora. They do still seem to be a couple, James Joyce and Nora Barnacle. And I was always charmed with the biographical accounts of the two of them. Nora has her own biography, and a lovely woman she was too. How she managed to put up with that mad genius James Joyce, one will never know, but he was not the easiest fellow to get along with. And but they still seem quite harmonious now, and I report that to you. Not much in detail, but let me see. Let me focus on that. Again, there seems to be a sort of James Joyce museum thing that they inhabit from time to time. A home with homely activities, and Lucia is there, the spiritual version of Lucia, their daughter, and I can definitely sense her presence. And it's almost as if they sort of got tired of being people visiting them all the time, or wanting to visit them as cultural icons, at least in the literary set anyway, and set up a sort of a museum where you can sort of go see versions of themselves that seem like very much like the Yates thing, but independent operators. Um, or maybe no, wait a minute, they've got it set aside for a couple of hours, an hour a day or something. And James seems to be working on some sort of, he is kindly sitting down and talking to me. Nora's off somewhere. Um, uh, oh, I don't know. His concern with language, his deep concern with language, as evinced in, Finnegan's Wake, for example. The almost impervious to understanding Finnegan's Wake. Although I did see a theatrical version of a certain section of it that was wonderfully illuminating here in Toronto. A theatre group acted out a certain section of it, and it was quite marvelous. And you got a definite sense of its theatrical dimension. Let's put it that way. So he says he's compiling a sort of a dictionary of a sort of a universal language, and he says it's a pointless task, but he's enjoying doing it anyway. He's got such a mind, and he loves to sing still. He was a keen amateur singer in his day, and is a little more professional about it now apparently, and does give concerts and performances on a fairly regular basis, and attends festivals celebrating his work and scholarly conferences, and at which people are, most impressed that he bothers to show up. He's definitely the cultural icon still, and he seems quite proud of that and his achievements in language and writing, and he doesn't seem to want to have a long conversation. Let's put it that way. I think Yates would have been happy to chatter on for the longest while. James Joyce, or the actual version of James Joyce that I'm with right now, is a little more curt, a little more dealing with me, and not in an unpleasant fashion, but efficient. And I guess he gets a lot of visitors and doesn't wish to be trammeled extensively. And I'm still not sure what version of James it is I'm talking to, and decide not to query it farther, as it might create a little irritation. But understand that he's fully functioning and involved in his post-mortem existence. And I think that's about all I'm going to get. And I stand up and shake his hand and thank him. And then I'm gone. I'm thinking about the famous dead as I, oh yes. I'm back in my own, quote unquote, my own astral plane cottage, that is described in More Adventures in Eternity, sitting in underneath one of the rose arbors, contemplating what I might do next. And there are other next things that happened last night, but I'm not sure if I've got time to describe them here. This is going to be the problem with this astral plane journal. The trying to fit it all in, as I've said several times before, it's just not going to happen. Unless I talk for 2 or 3 hours, which is probably not high in your agenda as you live your life and conduct your own explorations. So, because I've got, in my cottage, I've got the astral plane version of art prints on the wall, and I have several Jan Vermeers, because I'm very fond of that era of Dutch artwork, and Hooch as well, and 2 or 3 others, but very, the Vermeers I'm particularly fond of. And I thought about going to visit him, and or whoever he is now. I think he's probably reincarnated at this point, but there'll be a version of Vermeer that one can visit. There's a version of everybody, and you can spend much time thinking, well, is this the real is this the real life or just a fantasy, as that song by Queen goes. Because there are versions of things, and because there has to be, because there's so much interest, especially in cultural figures and entertainment figures. There has to be a way of coping with that, and various trends have been developed. I imagine many people want to see Frank Sinatra, for example. I mean, he still gives concerts. We know that, and I haven't seen any, but I know he does. And as will Tony Bennett when he passes. They all love singing. They love to see people happy. They love the thrill of the performance. So why not? And they've got fans everywhere. Of course, Elvis, of course. But understand that this goes on all the time. It's not just specific personalities that you might have an interest in. They're all on it, whether on a large scale or a small scale. As I said, there's a lot of people who are quite happy with little club performances done almost anonymously. When I first met Kurt Cobain out of body, and I don't know, 10 years ago, whatever it was, that's what he was doing, hanging loose and showing up at places and playing a guitar and singing, and not interested in whether people wanted to see him from the, because he died ahead of his generation. A lot of Kurt Cobain fans weren't dead when he was dead. And he went around also trying to disencourage depressed young people from committing suicide. And he would just hang out as a ghost beside them and try to give them positive thoughts, that sort of a thing, because he felt it was part of his karma, and he'd sort of helped create a trend, and it wasn't necessarily a good trend, and he should work against it if he could. And I related this in a fictional way in the novel An American in Heaven. There's a couple of brief encounters that the protagonist has with him, but they are based on encounters I had. And a small historical note: Goethe, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, the famous German writer and philosopher and scientist of the 18th century, he did a similar thing by creating a character in a novel, young Werther, who committed suicide and depression. And the success of the novel created a trend amongst, as I understand it, well-off young men who wish to emulate the gesture of suicide. I mean, I don't know much about it, but I understand the same thing went on. And I found out about this years ago in one of my other travels. But it's no more than coping with the karma of your actions. Everyone has to do it. And public figures involved in art and culture have a little more than the average person. The average person not involved in that has to cope with the karma of their actions and how it affected others after they passed on a personal level and cultural and sports figures too. Anybody that's famous in the public sphere, politicians, royalty, they've got a greater degree of karma to cope with because their actions affected more people. And that's a fairly obvious point, but I think it bears repeating. And so I'd love to talk to Krishnamurti. We'll get to that next time. He was the designated carrier of the Christ tradition in the Theosophical movement. Ledbetter saw him as a child, thought that is the aura of the next world teacher. The Theosophical Society under Bedder and Ledbetter and Annie Besant adopted him, trained him, educated him, and he became the voice of the Christ, the next Christ, the Maitreya. And at a certain point, he did that in the 1920s, I guess, 1900s, 1920s, and talked to many theosophists, inspired them, and then rejected the role and said he wasn't going to do it anymore. And it presented a very interesting conundrum for everybody concerned, although he kept teaching as Krishnamurti for many, many years after that. So I've always been curious about how he feels about this now, and I'll get to that next time. I didn't do it last night, but as I'm talking to you now, I'm thinking, oh yeah, there's the next thing. So until then, friends, have a good day.